Welcome to Mystara for another attempt to fix a conversion problem that happened between Beckme and 2nd edition. Namely, where did all the metallic dragons only come from? Back in the basic days, you had the chromatic dragons, the gem dragons, and the lone metallic in the form of the gold. Then 2nd edition came along, and suddenly the copper, bronze, brass, and silver dragons are on the menu with the encounter charts. So rather than just chalk it up to new edition weirdness, why not come up with an awesome story behind the other metallics and what happened when a god decided to try to muscle in on the Immortals? I'm Mr. Welch. Today we're making history. Mystara, unlike the other planets in the various settings, is not an old planet. In fact, it's probably the youngest of all the worlds, approximately 50,000 years old. Life did not evolve over time. Some of it was brought over when the Fae escaped the Dawn War. Others were created by the Immortals as they utilized their powers to populate the world. Mystara was created by the Old Ones to save who they could during the insanity of the Dawn War. The races were either created by Immortals, who missed their presence, or by ones that were experimenting with new forms of life. One of the first creatures that was spawned in this way was, of course, the dragon. Mystara dragons owe no allegiance to the progenitors of dragons of other settings. They were spawned by an unknown immortal, given free will and set loose upon the world. The dragon immortals they worshipped didn't create them, they ascended from them. The Great One and the other three dragon immortals, Opal, Diamond, and Pearl, are venerated because they represent the pinnacle of draconic excellence, rather than just some random extraplanar demagogue who demands you offer them sacrifices and worship, lest they weld you into a wall of souls as punishment for your insolence. But the gods need the worship of mortals. They're addicted to it. Without it, they weaken and die, while an immortal can sustain itself at any power level with the worship of just a single follower. The fewer worshippers a god has, the weaker they become. So when the Old Ones sealed off the countless mortals in Mystara from the threats and demands of the gods didn't take it well. The Great Barrier protects Mystara from the interference and predations of gods and other extraplanar creatures. When it was finished, gods were forbidden from entering Mystara, using their magics to affect its creatures, and they couldn't claim souls or gain any benefit from their worship. The Old Ones could pass through it, naturally, as they created it, but other powerful beings like Inevitables or Archfiends were similarly restricted. Lesser extraplanar creatures could pass through, but without the help of immortal magic, part of their being would be burned away during the transition. But this was not the case during the creation of the barrier. During the creation of the barrier, the gods didn't even notice, as the region of the multiverse contained within was devoid of life and ignored by the warring gods and primordials. As the barrier gained strength in the later days of the Dawn War, the Old Ones began creating worlds to be populated by future immortals. It was then that the gods noticed, but by then it was too late. The barrier was enough to keep gods from entering, though several were able to send avatars through to try and get around the prohibition. These avatars found themselves cut off from divine power, left as simple mortals in a new world. Many of the avatars died, but a few like Odin and Hel were able to obtain immortality in their new mortal forms. But one god was not going to be denied the worship of the creature she deemed hers. That was the dragon god Tiamat. She claimed domain over all the chromatic dragons, and upon hearing that dragons were being created that weren't under her control, she tried to breach the barrier, only to find it wouldn't budge. She dispatched several lesser-powered demonic servants and a few loyal draconic followers to confront the Mystaran chromatics, and also to demand their worship. The world that the dragon god's minions discovered was not fully formed. This was thousands of years before the rise of the Chthonian Empire, before the land had finished shaping itself. What they found was confusing and disturbing, as there were no gods. The draconic immortals had ascended by now, but these weren't the traditional deities that the Fiends swore their loyalty to. The dragons held no fear of the gods. They worshipped their immortals out of respect. Many of them knew one of the draconic immortals during their mortal life. Since their normal method of fear was not working, Tiamat's minions had to turn to a new tactic: bribery. As the Fiends tried to figure out a way to open the Great Barrier, the dragons tried approaching other dragons to see if they could be swayed to the service of Tiamat. It wasn't easy. Dragons don't react well to empty promises. Many of the agents had to hunt down magic items or kill weaker dragons to steal their hoard to use as down payments to sway the other dragons. They discovered that on rare occasions, chromatic dragons didn't share the same alignment as the other dragons, and that trying to sway them to Tiamat's side brought either disinterest or immediate hostility. More than one draconic agent of Tiamat died at the claws and jaws of a good-aligned chromatic dragon. While Tiamat's draconic minions were conspiring with the few dragons that would listen, the Fiends were seeking out other magics that could allow Tiamat to manifest on the world to claim it for her own. As there were no gods, she would be the only ones the mortals would worship. The demons dismissed the immortals as little more than demigod pretenders, weaker in power than actual gods. They made two important discoveries during this time. First, that the Great Barrier only worked against certain creatures, and it worked both ways. A demon would be seriously injured crossing into or out of Mystara, while a creature like a gnome wouldn't be scathed at all. Beings that were able to enter with the permissions of the Immortals risked permanent death if they were slain and unable to cross back through the Great Barrier. Several of the demon spies learned this the hard way during their time on Mystara. The Fiends were just a few dozen in number. Any more than that would have been easily discovered. They searched for sources of magic, as the mortals had little in the way of formal study of magic at this time. They sacked temples, tortured mages, and plundered artifacts looking for any information about the Great Barrier. The problem was that few knew about it, and even fewer still understood it. The Fiends finally resorted to simple trial and error, sacrificing creatures to see how their deaths would weaken it. The machinations of Tiamat's minions did not go unnoticed, though. While most dragons ignored the advances of her agents or just attacked them, some began spreading the word about dragons, talking about beings more powerful than immortals that were lurking on other planes. Silver dragons were the first to discover the plot, and word spread among the metallics about the suspected conspiracy. The Great One, along with Diamond, patron of lawful dragons, began tasking various metallic dragons in hunting down this conspiracy and finding out their true goals. Gold dragons were the first tasked with the mission, as they were natural shapeshifters and often well connected with mortal societies. The dragons quickly found the fiendish conspiracy in an ancient elven nation whose name is lost to time, and began rooting it out wherever they could. The more the gold dragons pursued the conspirators, the more the fiends went to ground. Soon the dragons were scattered across the globe hunting down these creatures. The pursuit would inadvertently save them from the fate of their cousins, though it would take ages before the gold dragons were able to get over their survivor's guilt. The other metallic dragons were tasked in finding the draconic agents of the yet-to-be-discovered usurper from another plane. They were a bit more successful than their gold cousins, as Tiamat's agents weren't exactly subtle in their efforts to persuade others to their cause. The metallic dragons began to close in on the agents, converging on a location where Tiamat's agents were beginning to congregate. Along with the various metallic dragons, several good-aligned chromatic and gemstone dragons joined up to finally end this conspiracy against the Immortals. But on a distant island now called Arentella, Tiamat's conspiracy achieved its goals. The Fiends had found a way to open the yet incomplete Great Barrier, and from a tear in the fabric of reality, the Dragon War began. Breaching the barrier was no small task. It was still relatively weak compared to its current state, but Tiamat needed to make a sacrifice on a scale no creature, mortal, or deity had ever seen. She burned 2 entire levels of the Abyss, using the countless souls destroyed to open the rift and send an army of dragons and demons through, with her manifesting on Mystara itself. The metallic dragons that were arriving on Arentella were immediately overrun. They fought bravely, but against hundreds of chromatic dragons and tens of thousands of demons they stood no chance. A few survivors scattered and fled, their numbers decimated. They sent word to the other dragons of this invasion, but Tiamat's influence had turned several of the chromatics to her side. Arentella was quickly overrun, and the war was starting to spread to wherever dragons nested. The few mortal societies had no hope of defeating an army of dragons and demons, as they were still in the Bronze Age. The Immortals had no idea what happened. The Great Barrier was supposed to be impenetrable. For a god to breach it and send across an army of minions was inconceivable. The destruction of 2 entire planes of realities shocked even the gods. The Great One recognized that only the dragon stood a chance of defeating the army, and it must be defeated quickly. He summoned Diamond, Opal, and Pearl, and then rallied every dragon to come to his aid as their immortals manifested directly on the prime material plane. The Mystaran dragons converged on Arentella as quickly as possible. While Tiamat had turned several to her side, they were still just a paltry few compared to the thousands of dragons coming to face her. Most that conspired with her were slain by their brethren or wisely went into hiding when they realized they didn't have numbers on their side. Tiamat's dragons moved to intercept the Great One's forces, and in the sky over the southern ocean, legends claimed it rained dragon corpses. While the battle overhead raged, Tiamat sustained the portal that kept her demonic hordes replenished. She was beginning to overwhelm the dragon with the sheer numbers of her fiends when she was confronted by the 4 immortals. The Great One was not as powerful as the dragon god, something that became obvious when they fought. She sported 5 heads to his 3, and while he was able to withstand her attacks for some time, it became obvious that she had gained the upper hand. She paused to gloat over her assured victory when the other 3 draconic immortals attacked. Singly she could have defeated any one of them, but now the fight was 4-on-1 and she was badly outmatched. She started to retreat when the Great One pinned her down and the others started tearing at her flesh. She dematerialized her avatar form and fled through the now collapsing portal, knowing that being trapped on the wrong side of the Great Barrier was to risk permanent death. Her demonic followers routed en masse, trying to get back to the Abyss, all the while being attacked mercilessly by the Mystaran dragons. Her fiends were slaughtered without exception, though a few were spared after swearing allegiance to entropic immortals. The dragons that were loyal to Tiamat were twisted into the Fey Wings, stripped of their sentience and left little more than feral beasts. The aftermath of the battle led to great changes in how the Immortals interacted with extraplanar creatures. The Council of Intrusion was formed to investigate any incursions from creatures that would threaten Mystara from other realms. To assist them, the Knights of Ebony were created from mortal agents. Meanwhile, the Great One created the Dragon Knights to help mortals and dragons deal with any future problems between them. The metallic dragons that had received the brunt of Tiamat's attacks were greatly reduced in numbers. While copper, silver, brass, and bronze dragons still exist on Mystara, their numbers are often no more than a few hundred compared to other dragons. Tiamat was badly humiliated. She greatly underestimated the power of Immortals. After the Battle of Arentella, the gods would not press the Immortals again. While the gods were individually more powerful, the Immortals were far greater in number on Mystara. The destruction of 2 levels of the Abyss was something that the other gods and Archfiends never forgave her for after her defeat. No other god would ever set foot on Mystara, and if they tried, they would face the wrath of every immortal rather than just a simple handful. That concludes the Dragon War. It's more of a tie-up of continuity problems. None of it's canon, and you can ignore it if you want. It happens well before Blackmoor, so it doesn't overlap with any of the other storylines. Next up, I'm looking at the Wizard Gargantuan, possibly the biggest overcompensator in the history of Dungeons & Dragons. But until then, quit dragging my heart around.